"Here is the heart of Richard, King of England." Well, that's great, but where's the rest of his body? This inscription was found on a sealed lead box found in France, which is not England. Why was the heart of a King of England found in France? And how can a biomedical analysis, including microscopy, chemistry, anthropology, and palynology, tell us about the post-mortem treatment of the body of England's Crusader king? There's a statue of him outside the Palace of Westminster in London, but Richard the Lionheart probably didn't spend his early life expecting to become King of England or an absolute chad of an animated lion. He was born in Oxford on September 8th, 1157, and while his father was King Henry II of England, their family ruled over a lot of land that wasn't England. Henry was also Count of Anjou and Duke of Normandy, and his wife, Richard's mother, was Eleanor, Duchess of Aquitaine. These territories are part of France, but this meant that both of Richard's parents were vassals of King Louis VII of France, who also happened to be Eleanor's ex-husband. However, Henry and Eleanor collectively held more land than King Louis, and it totally wasn't an awkward situation that honestly got even weirder as Richard grew up. The lands ruled over by Richard's parents are sometimes referred to collectively as the Angevin Empire. The name comes from Anjou, the county Henry II had inherited from his father. Henry and Eleanor had a whole bunch of sons, and they had planned to split up these different territories amongst those sons. Two of those sons, William and another Henry, were older than Richard. William died young, so Henry, called Henry the Young King, was set up to inherit the throne of England. In the original inheritance plan, Richard would inherit the Duchy of Aquitaine from his mother Eleanor. Okay, quick tangent here. Henry the Young King was actually crowned king while Henry II was still alive. This was a practice that they had kind of borrowed from the French monarchy, and it was a way of ensuring a smoother succession in the future. But Henry the Young King never really ruled England, and this arrangement caused some family drama. He is not Henry III, that's a different guy. We are not done with our list of dudes named Henry. The family drama really kicked off in the 1170s, when Eleanor and some of her sons revolted against Henry II. The revolt failed, and Eleanor was imprisoned. In 1183, Henry the Young King died, so that's their son. King Henry II died 6 years later, making Richard King of England, as well as Count of Anjou and Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine. He let his mom out of prison. So far, this feels like kind of your normal Crusader Kings playthrough, and we haven't even gotten to the actual crusading yet. Up to this point, Richard had spent most of his adult life in France, and he spoke French. He spent maybe about 6 months in England during his 10 years as king. In 1190, not long after becoming king, Richard set off on the Third Crusade to become a side character in the first Assassin's Creed game. He left his mom Eleanor in charge and just pieced out towards Jerusalem. On the way to the Holy Land, Richard teamed up with Philip Augustus, King of France. So Philip was the son of King Louis VII, Eleanor of Aquitaine's ex-husband, and he and Richard had beef because Richard didn't want to marry Philip's sister Alice. Richard married someone else instead. Another crusader, Duke Leopold of Austria, also had beef with Richard after he felt humiliated by Richard. This was the result of some crusade drama. Leopold's desire for revenge would come back to bite Richard in the ass. Philip eventually pieced out and left the Holy Land to go and deal with some problems in France. Richard kept crusading for a while until he learned that his brother, Prince John, was plotting against him. Richard decided to leave the crusade and go and deal with the John problem in 1192. This did not go according to plan. Richard was captured by Duke Leopold of Austria in December of 1192 after ending up in Leopold's territory. Leopold got his revenge, imprisoning Richard in a castle. But this pissed off the Pope, who then excommunicated Leopold because you weren't supposed to treat Crusaders badly. Leopold was a vassal of the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI, so our third Henry, who paid Leopold to gain custody of Richard. Henry VI also had beef with Richard, and although they did reconcile, Henry did not release Richard. He ransomed Richard, asking for a ton of money in return for his release. Having beef with Richard the Lionheart was very lucrative. Once the ransom was paid, Richard was released in February of 1194. While Richard was in prison, his other rivals continued to cause some problems. Prince John, who would later go on to become a Disney villain with some mommy issues, visited King Philip of France, and he was like, "Hey, want to help me overthrow my brother so I can be King of England?" Philip decided that was a great idea and went to go invade some of Richard's lands. Richard eventually reconciled with John after his revolt failed, but there was a lot more conflict between Richard and Philip, and between Richard and his own vassals. While dealing with these conflicts, Richard was seizing the castle of Chalus-Chabrol, which is owned by a particularly treacherous vassal in Aquitaine, who had been disloyal to Richard. On March 26, 1199, Richard was wounded by a crossbow bolt. Although the bolt was removed, the wound was infected and developed gangrene. With gangrene, bodily tissues die as a result of a loss of blood supply to that tissue. Today, treating gangrene involves removing that damaged tissue and using antibiotics to treat any underlying bacterial infections. Severe cases of gangrene might need to be treated by amputating an infected body part. This actually happened to Leopold of Austria. You remember that guy who imprisoned Richard? Leopold injured a foot in a horse riding accident. His foot developed gangrene and was amputated, but that wasn't enough, and Leopold didn't survive. Richard might also have developed sepsis, meaning his immune system had an extreme reaction to his infection. This creates widespread inflammation throughout the body, and that can damage bodily tissues and internal organs instead of fighting the infection. Like gangrene, sepsis can be treated with surgery to remove damaged tissue and antibiotics if the underlying infection is being caused by bacteria, as well as any other supportive care depending on what the patient needs. These treatments, however, were not available to Richard. He died on April 6th, 1199, and apparently he actually pardoned the guy who shot him. Richard left pretty detailed instructions for what he wanted done with his remains. In my video about Prince Louis Charles, the son of King Louis XVI of Marie Antoinette, I talked about a tradition among French royalty of removing hearts and internal organs from a royal corpse, and then embalming them and burying them separately from the rest of the body. There's actually a fancy Latin phrase for this practice, dilaceratio corporis. Richard followed that tradition. Richard decided his body should be buried in the royal abbey of Fontevraud, where his mother Eleanor had retired. She would eventually be buried there as well. Richard had his entrails sent to Aquitaine. Entrails is a fancy word for intestines or internal organs, but Richard's heart was embalmed and buried in the Cathedral of Rouen, the capital of Normandy. The tourism website for the city describes the cathedral as intimate and flamboyant. And while I feel the need to share that fact, let's also take a moment to admire the Gothic architecture. In all seriousness, it's incredible. Richard's heart would rest in this cathedral until excavations in 1838. On July 31st, historian Achille de Ville discovered a sealed lead box with the inscription, Hic jacet cor Ricardi Regis Anglorum. Here is the heart of Richard, King of England. This is not how I thought I was ever going to actually use my minor in classical studies. Well, no harm ever came from opening a box, so what was in this box? The remains of Richard's heart had decayed into a brownish-white powder. In 1856, the contents of the box were placed in a new crystal reliquary, which wouldn't be opened again until the biomedical study of the heart and the embalming materials that was published in 2013. What was the point of this study? The scientists involved used multiple methods of analysis to try to gain a better understanding of the post-mortem treatment of Richard's remains. There were, however, a few tests they didn't include in their study. They didn't carry out any genetic analysis of the remains. There was no question of the remains being inauthentic. There was no doubt that this really was Richard's heart. They also didn't carry out any C14 radiocarbon dating. The materials used in the embalming could have contaminated the sample too much to give good results, and it was decided that taking samples for those tests would have been too destructive. DNA testing would have been very destructive as well. I thought I knew how to pronounce reliquary. Apparently I don't. Under a microscope, the scientists identified the remains from the reliquary as being human muscle. They couldn't determine if it was specifically heart tissue. It might have just decayed too much to be able to tell. Then they brought out the scanning electron microscope. Very fancy. This showed them a lot of different pollen grains belonging to different plants. Mint, daisy, myrtle, bellflower, poplar, oak, and pine. They also detected frankincense. This is going to be important later. Elemental analysis showed large amounts of lead from the original box that contained the heart, as well as trace amounts of antimony, mercury, and copper. Okay, let's put this in the context of medieval burial practices. The pollen grains could come from embalming products or be the result of airborne contamination. The authors of the study explained that they would have to go and read up on some medieval or Renaissance accounts to see if any writers mentioned those plants being used in the embalming process. What writers from the time do talk about, though, is the use of mercury in the embalming process. Two French surgeons, Henri de Mondeville and Guy de Chauliac, both wrote about mercury, sometimes called quicksilver, not that one, in this context. However, both of these men were writing a long time after Richard died, and we don't have written accounts describing embalming practices or materials from during the time that Richard lived and died. Mercury has been found in other royal burials, like those of Queen Anne of Brittany and King Charles VII of France, both of whom are buried in the Cathedral of Saint-Denis. It was also found in the burial of John of Lancaster, Duke of Bedford, who was buried in Rouen Cathedral like Richard's heart. John's remains have also undergone some scientific examination and analysis, so let me know if you'd like to see a video about that. Besides the mercury, what Richard and those other individuals have in common is very high social status. They were royalty, so they could afford rare, expensive materials like frankincense. Embalming wasn't a burial practice for everyone in medieval Europe. So why embalm these people? For Richard, there was a practical aspect to preserving his remains. If we remember, according to his instructions, his separated body parts needed to travel to their final resting places. Rouen is about 530 kilometers from where Richard died. There's also some symbolism behind the embalming process and the products used, especially the frankincense. Using frankincense on Richard's body was meant to connect him to the divine, specifically to Jesus Christ, a pretty important guy for a medieval Christian. It was given to Jesus at his birth, and Jesus' body was scented with spices by Joseph of Arimathea before being placed in his tomb. So the treatment given to Richard had ties to the context in which he lived, a means of asking for forgiveness for his sins as he transitioned from life into death. Apparently, frankincense also smells really good, so it would be a lot better than having to smell putrefaction and decomposition on the way to Rouen. What did this contribute to our knowledge of the past? It shows us more about the care given to Richard's body after his death, and fills in the gaps left in the historical record, with that lack of written accounts from the time of Richard's death. I would argue that Richard the Lionheart has lived on after death, giving me enough material for pop culture references. But it's also super interesting to learn something about the world in which he lived, and what was considered important for his remains from those remains. His treatment in death reflected Richard's life as a royal individual raised in France and as a Christian. It was important to Richard that he be buried in France and do what he could to connect himself to the divine. I hope you found this interesting. If you're interested in learning more about Richard and his dynasty's royal family drama, there's a lot. I recommend The Plantagenets by Dan Jones. It has been several years since I read this, but Dan Jones is a really good writer. Let me know in the comments what other stories of scientific analysis of dead royalty you'd like to see on this channel, and thank you for watching. I absolutely use this video as an excuse to watch Disney's Robin Hood, and bring a friend!